And it also has a Roald Dahl.
I've never been certain of how to pronounce his name.
Roald
Dahl. Welcome to Shoulda Books, the podcast about all the books you should have read by now. My name is Jonathan, and today I am joined by screenwriter and filmmaker Zachary Donohue. Zachary, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So we were just talking in the Patreon cold open about your movie, Passenger, which you co-wrote, which is it's out right now in theaters, and it is scary. It gave me a nightmare, and but I survived, and I didn't just survive. I had a good time.
Awesome.
I really enjoyed it, and I think everyone should see it, even if you don't like horror movies like me. Maybe you're a little bit of a baby, and but it's still a fun ride. But thank you for being here. And we were just talking kind of in the cold open about horror in general, and we were talking about what you're looking for in a horror movie. What's your favorite horror movie if you had to pick one?
The Shining.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
What about The Shining? Why that one?
It's a movie that I can rewatch and always find new things. It's deeply unnerving and creepy. Liminal spaces is now a very hot thing, and that movie, it incorporates a lot of liminal spaces with the halls that Danny is riding his little bike down. I just think that the location is, one of the best horror movie locations that we've ever seen on film. And the acting is incredible.
It's so good.
Across the board with everyone that's in the movie, not just Jack Nicholson.
Right.
Yeah.
It's certainly one of my favorite horror movies out of the dozen that I've seen. I don't know. I've seen a lot of the classics. And, I love Kubrick, and that film in particular is just, it rewards rewatching because there are so many levels. Have you seen the documentary?
Room 237.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? What is it about? What is for anyone who hasn't seen it, what's it about?
If I remember correctly, it's that there's a lot of hidden meaning in that movie, and that there's a lot of just random messages that Kubrick, I think the movie is arguing that he intentionally left them there. I think that there are some aspects that are maybe reaching a little bit. But it's a very interesting movie because like we were talking about, where it's you can rewatch it and see new things. This documentary goes in so deep and finds it's the wallpaper is
the filmmakers. I feel bad for the people in their personal lives because the amount of times you have to have seen that movie and spent on it. I'm what were you sacrificing in your life to get to that point? But yeah, I remember, it's been years since I've seen that documentary, but it was definitely, late at night, had consumed some substances, and it was I was I believe every single thing. I believe and then in the cold, harsh light of day, I'm okay, well, maybe Kubrick didn't fake the moon landing, but maybe he did.
Maybe he did.
Yeah. But this is not a conspiracy theory podcast. That's not one of those. It's not one of those. It could be. We'll see how the numbers do. But no, this is a podcast about books, and you have brought 3 books that you think everyone should read. The 3 that you brought, to my eyes, are not horror books. Do you read horror books?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm just an avid horror reader, and I was thinking 2 things going into this.
Okay.
One, the podcast is called Shoulda Books, and I didn't want to come in with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Okay.
Or Frankenstein.
Hey! Look, if that's how it's pronounced,
I figured that that is a book that probably a lot of people would have read. And Stephen King. I feel a lot of people. I love Stephen King, but I feel he's so widely read.
Yeah.
That I wanted to reach for some higher fruit, or not higher fruit.
You're okay, let's do some deeper cuts.
Deeper cuts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Frankenstein. Love that book. It's been a long time since I've read it, but I definitely want to do that as like part of our book club at some point for this show, which if you haven't checked out the book club, every month we cover a different classic book. This month we are covering a modern classic, Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee. So you can follow along at Fable, and there will be an episode about it. So stay tuned for that. But I've never read any Stephen King.
Oh, you should.
Okay.
You should.
Which one, what's a good one to start with?
Carrie,
Okay.
it's one of, I think it's his first book that got published in a big way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to misstate maybe he had like some
little drive engagement. If you say it wrong, people correct you. It's we all win.
Yeah, in the comments. Carrie, because it is also a short book. So if you don't want to be in the dark headspace for too long, it's a breezy read.
Okay.
And it's also a very interesting stylistic approach, because I believe it's like playing with different formats of like it's going between a traditional just a third person version, and then it cuts to these like police logs. Again, it's been 20 years since I've read it, but it's very innovative for when it came out.
Man, we're gonna keep going, even though the helicopter is yep, there it is. It's going to be really embarrassing if I'm actually able to like EQ out the helicopter, and then it's just us kind of sounding like we're like hallucinating. But that has its own charm. Books.
Or maybe you should like add like the sound of helicopter.
Yeah, here, I'll just
type it up.
There we go. I'll just loop that.
Yep.
Okay, so you have 3 books. They're not horror books, but they're books that you think everyone should read.
Yes.
Which one do you want to start with?
Well, we'll start with the top one.
Okay, yes.
So I brought in a book from my childhood called Sideways Stories from Wayside School.
Sideways Stories from Wayside School by
Louis Sachar.
I have not heard of this before. I'm not familiar with it. So what's this book about?
Well, he is the author of Holes.
Okay.
Which you might have seen.
Okay. I've never actually seen the whole movie. Pun intended. I've seen it in bits and pieces at my grandparents' house on cable. I've never seen it all the way from start to finish.
Oh, wow.
So anyway, do with that what you will.
Did you have the Scholastic Book Fair growing up?
So I was homeschooled. So I did not.
So your folks didn't roll in the Scholastic.
No, every now and then there was a teacher supply store that was in like the state capital. I grew up in North Carolina, and we lived in a very rural community. So like maybe once a year we would get to go to the teacher store that had all the like Scholastic books, and it felt like Christmas. It was so much fun. So I imagine that what you're describing is similar to that.
Yeah, I mean, this was when a Scholastic Book Fair came, you got like a pamphlet days in advance, and it had all the images of the books, and you would like cross off the ones you wanted, and then you take that home, and your parents would put like a $20 bill in, and then that would be delivered to your teacher or the librarian, and then a week later, these like giant steel aluminum like trolleys would be rolled into the library, and they would open up, and they would have all these children's books, and they would have like saved the ones like earmarked the ones that were for this is for Cindy, this is the one she bought, and so that was always a special day.
It sounds amazing.
Yeah. And I think Sideways Stories was one of the first books that I bought from the Scholastic Book Fair. And then, through the years, he went and wrote 2 more that are also, it was kind of like this, trilogy that I really adored as a kid. And I found out recently that he wrote one during COVID.
Oh, really? Okay.
That I haven't read, but it's cool that he went back to those characters.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of nostalgia in this pick, mainly because, you know, as a kid, there were only like a handful of books that like I truly like, you know, beyond the baby books and like the, you know, the Where the Wild Things Grow, you know, then I read like Hatchet and, you know, books like that. And I didn't, like, I thought Hatchet was okay, but like, you know, it was kind of more perfunctory reading. Like you had to, it was mandatory, you know. This, you know, was just like wacky and silly. And, you know, it's about this, you know, school that's built sideways.
Okay.
So it's already dealing with like impossible logic. There's like no 30th floor somehow. Like they built a 29th floor and a 31st floor, but they forgot to build the 30th floor. There's just like really like wacky, just kind of, I don't know, juvenile comedy in it that really just kind of spoke to me as a kid. You know, it's we had these books that were like almost like like barf was a very big thing back in the day, like barf humor. You know, and I remember there was a book that literally had like barf on it.
Hold on.
Oh, now we've got the motorcade.
Now there's a, what the fuck?
Motorcycle.
Oh my God. Okay, welcome back, everybody. The helicopter is still here. The other noise seems to have stopped. So we are going to continue on. And there's a coffee on the table now. For eagle-eyed viewers will see. But we're talking about Sideways Stories from Wayside School. How did this book make you feel as a kid?
I think the fact that it was so zany, wacky, and creative just opened. It was one of the first books to really kind of like open up the floodgates of imagination and having the license to be silly. I'm not a comedian, but I really appreciate comedy.
Yeah,
I really appreciate you know, a good funny movie and a good funny book. They're descending upon us now. But Sideways Stories from Wayside School, there's 3 of them.
Okay.
And I just ate these books up as a kid. They were unlike anything I had read at that point. So that was my thinking going into this, is that, you know, this was one of like the first just kind of, not necessarily a spiritual experience, but this was one of the first, I don't know, rite of passage books. Before I made the leap to reading Carrie and Stephen King.
You know,
it's an interesting, maybe a conversation for another time. But, you know, when you're a kid, you read, you know, YA stuff or, you know, books for kids. And then one day you're like, I'm going to make the jump to literature, you know, with a capital L or, you know, adult fiction. And then typically there's no going, I mean, I guess you could go back. You know.
But once you kind of walk out of the like brightly lit section and colorful section of the library and you walk into like the place where the shelves are taller and the books, like the spines of the books are darker
and
like
thicker.
Like I have such a like distinct memory of that kind of period of my life where I would like, you know, I would get most of my books from the young adult section. The shelf was like a little bit shorter. It was like down at like eye level. And then we're like, I'm gonna go try over this one. And it was. Did you ever read any Clive Cussler? Did the Dirk Pitt?
No, but
novels?
I had a lot of friends that read them, and I remember vividly the outdoorsy covers for all of them.
And it was the like that was like the gateway drug because there was like a YA version of some of his books where they had like taken out some of the sex and violence and stuff. And the neighbor's back. Fucking hell. And we're back again. Okay, so it sounds like this book really kind of sparked your imagination in a way that maybe some other things hadn't. What are some things that you write about now and things that you've done in your career as a screenwriter and filmmaker that you can trace back to this book?
When I revisited this book
Yeah.
for the podcast, I picked up a brand new copy and I read a few chapters, and what I really gleaned from it was this absurdist quality. There's a strange logic to this book. It's like kind of operating on its own wavelength where kind of anything goes, and there's just kind of a dry silliness to what happens. And it's funny because a couple years ago, I made a web series called The Unknowable, and that involves it's a horror mockumentary that involves a lot of public domain footage that has been recontextualized to be ridiculous.
Yeah,
but it's played totally straight, and the humor is just in how you're taking in all this really absurd facts, but it's presented in such a dry, matter-of-fact way that it hopefully the effect is that it's funny. And so I don't know, I really appreciated, like, kind of looking back at that there's just great wordplay, very bizarre contradictions that happen in this book, and it also has a Roald Dahl.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Butchering that.
I've never been like certain of how to pronounce his name.
Roald
Dahl.
Yeah. It honestly feels like, Louis Sachar was probably very high on Roald Dahl as a kid, and then was trying to bring this to millennials.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Huh.
If people who are listening have kids that are 8, 9, maybe it's a book to introduce to them.
If there's someone in your life who fits that demographic, this could be a great present. This could be a great conversation piece as well too. And
there's 2 more books, so it should be read as a series.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. What is the next book that you think everyone should read?
Book number 2 is a book that I read about 10 years ago called Replay by Ken Grimwood. This is it was written in, I think, 1987, I want to say. 1986, copyright.
Okay.
And it's referenced as one of the inspirations for Groundhog Day. It involves a time loop.
Gotcha. Right. Okay.
I am a sucker for time loop movies, but I think that this is, when I read it, I had obviously seen a lot of time loop stuff, just kind of done to death. But when I read it 10 years ago, I felt that what it did, and I'll go into that, was just so much more involved and quite interesting. And I know that they've been trying to make this as a movie. I think Robert Zemeckis was circling it 2011 or so. It's got a great first page.
Okay.
Where this guy, he's in his 40s, has a heart attack and dies.
Okay.
And then he wakes up a few pages later, 25 years back into his teens. I think he's 18.
Okay.
And he's now re-inhabiting his 18-year-old body, but he has in his consciousness the whole lived experience and the awareness of history that he had when he died. He then starts living his life, and it goes. He knows all these things, and he basically takes a different path.
Interesting. Okay.
He doesn't follow the same rules of how his life went. Instead of getting married and having a family, he just does a completely different. He has a whole new lease on life, I guess. And then when he turns 43, he dies again. And he wakes up and starts all over. And so it takes this cycle a little bit, but then within that, he meets another woman who is also experiencing the same exact thing as him.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And what I love is that it then turns into a sci-fi romance, where, they're kind of these, star-crossed lovers through time in a way, and they keep dying and resetting. But what starts happening, and am I giving too many spoilers?
No,
or should
I here, we'll put a spoiler warning.
Spoiler warning.
If you're intrigued by this book and you don't want to hear any more, this is the chance to skip over. But I want to hear.
Okay.
I want to hear.
So the escalation is that he stops resetting at 18 and the loop starts condensing.
Oh, interesting. Okay,
so,
gotcha. Yeah.
Now the stakes have been raised, and, as the book goes, the timeline gets shorter and shorter.
So gotcha.
There's a question of what's going to happen when, you reach that final loop.
Yeah.
And, through that, there's him trying to find this woman each timeline, his girlfriend. It's just a really interesting, thought-provoking book on life. I think the theme is, I think what speaks to me a lot about loop movies is the wish fulfillment of second chances.
Yes.
And the fact that it doesn't just do one day, it does a whole life.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause I like Groundhog Day. There's other movies like what was it? Palm Springs.
Palm Springs is great.
Recent one. Yeah. There is like a feeling of monotony. There's like a kind of like a sigh that I feel when I hear about one of those stories of like, okay, all right, it's going to be the same day. It's going to get boring, blah, blah, blah. But like repeating an entire lifetime is really interesting.
It is. And I actually don't, I haven't revisited this in 10 years. So, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I don't think there's actually an aspect of repetition. Maybe there is just like a little bit, but because he keeps, dying and waking up, and also the timeline becomes more truncated.
Right.
He zigs a lot,
Okay, yeah.
and then the timelines don't really have the opportunity to kind of do that thing from like Groundhog Day where he steps in the puddle every time.
Right.
It's not really that, which is interesting because I don't know what the first loop book or loop movie was. I think that this is an early one.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me that no one has ever done. I'm making proclamations that someone will be like, well, actually, yeah. I haven't. It was a fresh read to me because I had never seen such a long timeline.
Yeah.
Looped.
And there's so much more you can do with that. When did you read this?
10 years ago.
10 years ago. Okay.
I was 30.
Okay.
It kind of hit at the right time, just in terms of like, I was out in LA, career wasn't quite working, just hustling and grinding. And that idea of like, am I making the right choices? Is it a mistake to be out here? Should I be in New York, on Wall Street? I don't know.
Yeah.
Should I be a lawyer or a doctor?
Right. Right. Yeah.
There was a review that really turned me on to this. It was from an old, it's not here anymore, but it was a fan, like a sci-fi blog called Birth Movies Death. And before that, it was called Badass Digest. And
I see why they changed the name. Yeah.
I don't know if it was, but someone had read it and written a very glowing review of like, you should have read this.
Yeah.
So that was, someone had put that out there as a shoulda. And, I guess I'm now 10 years later in a new platform being like, you know what? That guy was right. I forgot, I'm not giving the proper credit, but maybe you could put in the comments if we dig it up. But anyways, I'm continuing the cycle of letting people know that Replay by Ken Grimwood is I don't know, it might speak to some people.
Just hearing about it, like the reason I asked, when you read this is because I do think this sounds like the sort of book that will hit harder the older you get, and I think the more time you kind of accrue under your belt, it's like the famous ending of The Great Gatsby, where it's, we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. It's like, when I read that when I was, 18, I read the book for the first time. I was like, that's a pretty sentence, but it doesn't mean anything because you don't have a past in the same way, but like now in my mid 30s, it's like, oh yeah, okay. There are definitely large chunks of time that I've had a lot of time to think about and reanalyze and be like, man, wow, if I had made this like slightly different decision, would my life look like this? Would it look like that? Does this book help you come to peace with that in any sort of way?
Yeah, I mean, I was reading a review this morning because, again, I didn't reread it for this, but I was reading a review this morning that was just saying that the message of this book is one of, you just have to live your life not looking back in the rear view.
Yeah.
That sometimes you'll make the wrong choice.
Yeah.
But you have to pick yourself up and keep moving. Yeah. And, because unlike the dude in Replay, we only have one life to live.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think I found this to be a very profound piece of sci-fi lit.
It's never been harder to keep our eyes off the rearview mirror than it is right now. You have your own kind of personal artifacts in the form of like social media that like you can constantly look at. But then it's also like, I think culturally, the cultural eye is much more on the past than it is on the future right now because the future's fucking scary right now. But there's just like, there's so many things that are period pieces. Mm-hmm. Like I think about how a lot of kind of the top tier directors, like the ones who are, winning Best Picture and Best Director at the Oscars each year, like they're all making period pieces.
That's interesting.
And it's, and it's
simpler times, I guess.
Simpler times, I guess. Yeah. But it's like,
but were they?
Exactly. Yeah. Were they? And it's like, I think of like, speaking of 10 years ago, 2016, and like, yeah, I certainly can start to look at that with rose tinted glasses. But when I actually remember like what it was like at the time, one, I remember being like, how is anyone going to be nostalgic for this? Like, this fucking sucks. How in the world are we going to like look back on this fondly? And it's like, that's just how the human brain works. It's like, doesn't matter how bad shit is. If it's in the past, like you can contextualize it and like kind of where the story goes. So there's a comfort in knowing where the story goes that you don't feel right now.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. And I experienced this the other day because I was looking for a photo from the shoot of Passenger.
Yeah.
And when you go through your photo album, you swipe up on the phone, and it started to dawn on me this like creepiness of like, at a certain point, like in all your social media, time can be, just distilled down to, a couple swipes back, and then boom, you're back 10 years ago, and that's it.
Yep.
And I didn't really like that feeling, and it kind of like, especially like for like social media, like if you go back to like old Instagrams, it kind of makes me want to like just get off and delete, just because I don't like how time is like so easily visualized in that way. I kind of want it to be more abstract, as opposed to like, well, yep, that, those 200 photos or 1,000 photos, that's a year,
right? How does that make you feel seeing time visualized like that? Like what does that kind of bring up? Like,
I'll give you another example. Our daughter was born shortly after the production of the movie, and we got into taking a photo a day of her. And at the end of the year, we rewatched the movie. It's like they're like 1 second little videos.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
And so you're basically going through 5 minutes in a year, and you see every day you're like either, especially in the early stages, you're like, oh, yep, that's us in the bedroom with the baby. That's us in the living room. Oh, we finally went out to dinner here.
Yeah.
And just seeing all of that year collapsed into like 5 minutes is like, it's beautiful to see, obviously, the how the baby like changes so much in 1 year. It's kind of insane.
Yeah.
But it's also just crazy to be like, wow, that's a year. And I know that there are some people who do these like weird film projects where they take photos of themselves every day, for like 10 years, almost like a Richard Linklater thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like, it's interesting, but I'm not into that.
I don't need to see that. Yeah.
It creeps me out too much. So,
yeah. No, it's funny. I saw a post the other day that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. And it's one of those things where it's like, it's very obvious and kind of banal, but it still kind of tripped me out, which is that like, if there was an observer 2,000 miles away who was looking at Earth right now, they'd be seeing the Roman Empire.
My dad watched this and he told me about it this weekend.
Okay, yeah. So it must be making the rounds.
You guys are on the same algorithm.
I've got your dad's algorithm.
Yeah. What are you like watching like a lot of like astronomy content?
I guess
or
so.
Like,
now I don't know.
Astrophysics.
Yeah, I think
string theory.
I think I get just kind of like, I wouldn't say they're motivational, but kind of motivational style philosophy posts get served to me. And like, that didn't really motivate anything other than just
what is time?
Whoa, dude.
Do you? I mean, like we're going off topic, but do you actually believe that theory of if you look through exactly what you're just saying, if you look through the telescope, you would see dinosaurs like that? That's wild to me.
I think it's true, because I mean, it's like if light takes, if there's something 100 million light years away and I'm looking at it, that means that that light is 100 million years old. So
it's
just
crazy.
Mind blowing. It's crazy to think about. It's just crazy to think that like that we can be looking at stuff that is that old, and that something could be looking at us in that way too. And it's also just a fun way to kind of bring back the whole thinking about the Roman Empire thing, because that was such a thing, and then it kind of fell off. And I think we need to get back to thinking about the Roman Empire at all times.
I mean, it sounds like this whole idea sounds like a new Chris Nolan movie.
Oh yeah. I got in a debate the other night. I had a friend who's like, I think the Odyssey's going to suck.
Oh,
and
hot take.
A very hot take. And he was like, when I'm right, I want you to apologize to me.
Wow.
And I was like, I don't think you're right. I think it's going to be a good movie.
I think so too. I think it's a risky move. It's a bold move to bet against Nolan.
Yeah.
But
we'll check the tape. And in terms of, keeping a record of your life. I mean, what is a podcast other than that?
Exactly.
Just like I'll get to, this summer, I'll get to look back at this episode and rub it in my friend's face when he's wrong, and the Odyssey is awesome. Although he could be,
Yeah. I mean, it's what, one of like the first great tales.
Some of the casting choices are a little interesting in terms of like Matt Damon doing his American accent, although all the accents would be arbitrary. I think that like there's a lot of discourse around like we all just assume that old timey should be British, and it's like there's kind of a there's a colonialist nature and element to that is a little icky. That being said, it's still kind of weird to see Matt Damon dressed in the stuff, just speaking in his American accent.
Yeah. Let's go.
Let's go. Yeah. At least he's not doing the Boston.
Yeah, exactly.
Ithaca's wicked far. Wicked far. But do you have any final thoughts on Replay?
I think it's it won the 1988 World Fantasy Award.
Okay.
So you would think, and maybe again, I'm just not in the right circles, but you would think it would be more talked about
Yeah.
now, or it would have been adapted now.
Yeah.
You know, any producers out there listening,
Hey.
I'm your guy.
All right. Well, we're going to take another quick break, and then we'll be back with your third and final book. All right. Welcome back to the helipad. We've got your third and final book here. What have you got?
I have Heavier Than Heaven, a biography of Kurt Cobain, written by Charles R. Cross.
I'm really excited to talk about this. Okay, so this is good old Kurt.
Good old Kurt.
Are you a Nirvana fan?
Huge Nirvana fan.
Okay.
But I actually have a interesting relationship with them. I know a lot of, people probably just, got into them whenever they did and were, fans or not fans.
Yeah.
I want to say I was like 6 or 7, maybe 8, the year that he passed away.
Okay.
But I remember that, like, his face was on every magazine.
Yeah.
Anywhere you look. When I was growing up, he was just like this, he was a rock god, like through all of the late 90s. And, it's interesting in the monoculture that we had kind of pre-internet, that, when I was in high school by, the early 2000s, all my friends were listening to Nirvana as if it had just come out, which is, I was thinking about that today. Like, that'd be like, if a kid discovered Chapel Rowan and then 10 years, well, I guess, no. Okay. So Chapel Rowan has her big moment like 2 years ago, right? That'd be like a kid discovering Chapel 8 years from now and treating that as like a very like cool of the moment thing.
Yeah.
I'm from a small town, so pre-internet, the way news kind of traveled was just kind of word of mouth, and that's how like trends would just kind of filter into our high school. You know,
that's really interesting. Yeah, that there's like kind of a lag.
There's a lag.
Yeah, that's not the case today.
Yeah. A part of me wonders, like, is everything just like, if someone's listening to like Charlie XCX, is it just hot for that moment, like that summer, Brat Summer?
Yeah.
Like, but if you're in high school right now, does Brat Summer live on for a couple years, or are you just every summer it's a new?
Yeah. I mean, look,
thing?
I'm not going to pretend to be able to speak for the teens of today, but it does feel like the cycle of cool is very, very quick.
Very quick.
It's very quick. And it tends to be the sort of thing that, like, by the time people like me find out about it, the moment's passed. But yeah, that's so interesting to think about how trends used to spread.
Yes.
Before, because it would have been through like radio, MTV,
other kids who are from other towns who then like kind of pass on this level of coolness and what they're into. Obviously, we had MTV. Yeah. Right. So like we're getting a lot of our music from that, but like there were a lot of fads and stuff that just kind of through osmosis, I guess.
Was there a cool kid from outside town who like brought Nirvana to your town?
I wish that was the case. That would be so cool.
You're like, yeah. It was me.
I was from Seattle.
Yeah.
No, I was from upstate New York. And so I was 8 when he passed away. Okay. Was not really listening to the music, but I was like kind of aware of, that he was an icon just through, occasionally when I would, someone had MTV on, I would see it. So it wasn't until like a few years later when I was in middle school that I first was like properly introduced to Nirvana, and I went to a CD store and I bought an album, The Muddy Banks of Wishkov, which is their live album. I thought it looked like the cover looked really cool.
Mm-hmm.
They looked cool.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I listened to it at night in bed, and then I felt weird and guilty about it. And then I returned it.
Really?
I returned it. I don't know
Oh,
why.
wow. And they took it back?
They took it back.
Wow.
Yeah. And then I think a month passed, and I had been thinking about it.
Uh-huh.
Like I was like, oh, why did I return it? It's cool.
Yeah.
I mean, it just sounded like the sound of it was so raw and weird that I went back and I rebought it. And from there, the rest is history.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you dig into that a little bit more of like how it made you feel? Like, what did you feel guilty about? Did you feel guilty like for listening to it? Did you feel guilty for what it made you think about or how it made you feel?
Before then, and it's interesting because like we're talking about, Louis Sachar, and then the jump to
that's a pretty steep
adult literature.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, the bands that I listened to were primarily the Beatles and Tom Petty,
right,
and the Police.
Yeah.
And so this is like so I don't know, like kind of like cliche, I guess, but like when I first heard those notes, it just was so unlike anything I'd ever heard,
right?
And it felt wrong, and it was loud, and it was distorted and abrasive, but I loved it, and so from that point on, I got a guitar, and then was in a rock band all through.
Hell yeah.
Through high school, and the classic thing when you are first learning how to play guitar is like, can you play "Smells Like Teen Spirit"?
Yeah.
And so, I learned how to play that. I did know how to play it.
Could you still?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's bring out the guitar.
That would be cool.
What was the name of your band?
The first version of the band was called Table for Four. But instead of the words, it was the number 4-4.
Table for four. Okay, that's clever.
Then we became Subside, and that was the edgier version of the band.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was basically the same members, just we got a new drummer.
Maybe got some more piercings. Got a van.
Yep.
Okay.
So music has always been an important thing for me.
Yeah.
And then, went to college and just continued. Nirvana is always a band that I'll circle back to.
Yeah.
And thinking about when I was young and I looked up to Kurt, who, passed away when he was only 27.
Yeah.
There was, we're speaking about time here, from Replay, 27 when I was younger felt like a really long time.
Advanced age. Yeah.
And, he packed a lot into that. He had he was successful very young. He, wrote some amazing songs that I think are timeless, wrote some beautiful lyrics. And now that I'm actually past 27 by, a decade, I've come to realize that time is very short.
Yeah.
But also pretty incredible still that the accomplishments in that period of time are I still find incredible.
Yeah.
So I had always kind of idolized Kurt and found him to be a fascinating tortured soul. And so I wanted to learn about him, and I picked up this book, Heavier Than Heaven, which is a very I think beautifully written, compassionate and engrossing account that it tells from birth to death, just a kind of a very compassionate account of his life. Because he had he had complications with drug addiction and mental health, and the book takes all of that into. I mean, it talks about that in a respectful way. Yeah.
When I was in my early 20s, there was a part of me that was like, it'd be kind of cool to be in the 27 Club. Because like, you know, it would mean that like, that I really fucking did something.
Yeah.
You know? And I remember, and it wasn't like I was really trying to, but it was like I idolized so many people like that. Like I was, you know, I've always been kind of a casual Nirvana fan, but like what I really loved about Kurt Cobain was like his kind of iconoclastic nature and how he kind of did things on his terms, and also was like always kind of sticking it to the man, you know, like,
I mean, yeah.
But I remember when I turned 27 and being like, okay, or rather, I remember when I turned 28 and being like, okay, it didn't happen, and I'm glad. I'm very glad, and yeah, it's the older I get, the more I'm like, how fucking stupid it is to think that way.
Yeah.
But I think that a lot of people, whether they admit it or not, when they're younger, do think that way because there's been so many stories like this, you know? So,
especially in music.
So what was your kind of, how did you feel about, you know, that mythos of these like famous people dying at 27 before you turned, like when you were in high school or when you were, you know, in your early 20s?
No, I was deeply fascinated about it, and I just kind of wanted to know, you know, what did he, you know, pack into that life?
Yeah.
You know, like what were all the concerts, the tours, you know, the shows that he played. And what I will say is that I have read a decent amount of true crime fiction.
Okay, yeah.
And what I don't, true crime is a very fascinating genre. What I don't love is the books that like sensationalize and glorify, especially if it's like dealing with, you know, murders, you know, serial killers and like dark stuff like that. I don't like to read stuff that is just, you know, favoring the gruesomeness, the brutality. And I'm more just wanting to know the facts. I've always been a very inquisitive person. Some people, like, you know, will be like, you're kind of an interrogator, you know, and really it's just that I want to be like, if someone is telling me a story and they leave out like certain details of like, you know, what is the context of it? Like, I can't just be told like a story that, you know, is so interesting, but you're like, you know, you're not telling me like how you felt, or, you know, you're like, for instance, if you were like, oh yeah, yesterday I got robbed, but I'm okay, you know, I would have so many questions.
Yeah.
More questions than most people would be happy about. You know, like in typical conversation, you know, people would be like, okay, you were where, and how much did they take from you? Or you're okay, like blah blah blah. You know, so.
And you're like, so like, what size shoe are you? And okay, you double knot?
Maybe.
You
know, like,
if it's relevant. If they stole my shoes,
yes,
you'd want to know.
Or if you ran and you fell, I would be like, well, were your shoes?
What were you wearing?
Yeah, were they
Nikes,
laced?
Adidas? What are we talking?
Yeah. So that's how, you know, whenever there's like, you know, something like a true crime book, I'm more just wanting to know just the facts, and I don't want them to be like written in a sensational way that, like, you know, glorifies the killer and doesn't, you know, paint a vivid picture of like the life of the, you know, the person that was murdered.
Right.
You know, and I actually think that true crime seems to, you know, there was a moment where that was acknowledged, and, you know, I recently bought a book about the Black Dahlia murder.
Oh, okay.
Which is really interesting because it's so heavily about telling her story. That, you know, usually is kind of brushed to the side, and it's more about like this, who is the killer?
Yeah.
You know, And so, when approaching a book like this, there's a lot of opportunities where, it could veer into talking about like, painting that like tortured soul in a very, I don't know, like taking advantage of that material for the sake of entertainment.
Yeah.
And I didn't think that it was portrayed that way. I thought it was just beautifully written, a very in-depth look that just kind of presents facts without necessarily giving an inevitability. But again, when you're reading it, that is
spoiler alert.
Yeah,
we kind of know how it ends. Yeah,
yeah. But I thought it was a sensitive read. Yeah, and I was very happy that I read about it because I came out of it understanding, his upbringing, just his relationships and friendships. It's a really, if you're, a fan of, biographies, I think this is tops. Especially if you're curious about, Kurt Cobain. I would give it a read.
Do you feel like you learned anything about fame from reading this story?
It seems like the takeaway that I had is that the goalposts move. That you can, and again, I haven't read this in a few years, but this is when you ask this question, this is my kind of crude answer. So I'm hoping that I'm giving this justice, but basically that you can sell out shows do these, you've made it, you're living the dream, and that sometimes that might not necessarily be enough and the goalpost might move. I don't know if that's, again, I'm extrapolating from your question and kind of putting it on my memory of how it was. So, someone might read it and be like, that's not.
Well, I think that is something that comes up on the show a lot, which is that like, the truth is you're not going to remember every book you read. You're not going to remember every detail. But what you are going to remember and take with you is like how it made you feel. And how it made you feel informs opinions and decisions that you make years moving forward.
Exactly.
And so like if that is I just from what I know about Kurt Cobain, I haven't read this book, but that seems very accurate of just like and it also, I think, is accurate just to my own lived experience of just like whether it's, fame or it's, money or anything like that. Like you set these benchmarks where you're like, oh, once I get X, then I will feel complete. I'll feel fulfilled. I'll feel whatever. And then you get to X, whether that's, a follower count or that is an income, or that's living in a new city, whatever. Like you get that thing and it's not ultimately going to fulfill you, because like that has to come from within, like you have to like whatever your situation is right now, if you don't feel at peace and you don't feel that like, that ability to just kind of sit with yourself, like no external thing is going to change that.
Exactly.
And it's that's what's so tragic is like you have this brilliant, sensitive, creative soul, and he never got that.
And what I will say about the time and place that I read this, I was delivering alcohol for an app called Saucy at the time.
Okay.
This was right before COVID. This was 2019.
Okay.
And so every night you would, park at the liquor store and wait for the orders to come in. And I remember reading this book and, so I would park, read a few pages, and then I would do my delivery runs and I would be listening to Nirvana.
Oh, wow.
And one time I got an order and it said, I didn't quite read the name. And it takes me up to the Hollywood Hills. And this is no joke. I was still reading the book. Book is in my car. I'm coming up the road. I'm blaring Nirvana. And then I get to the house and I look at the name on the order, and it's Kurt Cobain's daughter.
No way. Oh my God. Frances?
Frances Bean, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and so I it was like a bottle of wine or something, and she answers the door, and I'm like, oh God, I hope she didn't hear the music that I was blaring as I'm bombing up the driveway. She was very nice, and I was just kind of in shell shock. I was like, hi, and then went back and was like, that is one of the strangest things that will probably ever, like, what a weird synchronicity of time and coincidence.
That's the magic of LA, is like every now and then the currents like converge in such a way that it like delivers this incredibly strange and strangely profound experience. Do you remember what song was like playing when you pulled up?
It was definitely from the Nevermind album.
Okay.
Because I think I was reading about that section. What was interesting and kind of fun was, as you go through the book, it talks about like the recording of the first album, Bleach.
Yeah.
And so I would just sequentially listen to the music.
Yeah.
It would talk about like, well, he wrote this song when he was going through this, or this is, so I would read about that, and then I would, kind of reward myself with a little music, and then kind of, like reappreciating the songs from a different perspective.
Yeah.
And then once I made that delivery, I was like, oh, wow, this has now changed my entire context of this song. Wish I knew what it was.
Yeah, that's a cool thing to do. I did that with Lou Reed's biography of like listening to the albums as you're like reading it. It's a cool thing to do. Favorite Nirvana song?
On a Plane, Plain.
Okay. I don't know if I know that one off the top of my head.
If you can get the rights, maybe we can. That could be the outro.
I can definitely. I'll put it on the Patreon.
The Patreon.
There we go.
Good.
Well, Zachary, as we wrap up, I have a gift for you.
Oh my God!
A book for you that, I think. Well, one, there's a good chance you've read it, so I hope that's not the case. But yeah, I thought that I was like, what's one of the scariest books that I've read recently?
Ooh.
So if you want to go ahead and...
Thank you so much.
Of course, yeah. You can tear that open.
Okay, this has now turned into an unboxing show.
Yes. And it's always difficult with the handheld mics.
Yeah.
But you know what? You're crushing it so far. You know what? Yeah, this is the ASMR section. Wow, you're really getting the... this has been a sonically rich episode, I got to say.
I have... not read that, but I am a big fan of Octavia Butler.
Hell yeah.
Wow.
Okay, so it's Parable of the Sower, by Octavia Butler.
Oh, this is awesome. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you for being here. Fans of the show know this is a book that has come up multiple times. We covered it back when this show was part of Try Guys. And it's I think a very terrifyingly relevant book to right now. It's not a horror book per se, but it definitely has horrific elements to it. But it has a lot to say about like humanity and where we are at as a society. And it sounds like you've read some of her other works.
I read. It's been a minute, but part of the Patternist series.
I haven't read
Wild Seed. I read. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, she's awesome.
Awesome. Well, before we go, we've talked about Passenger. Obviously, people check it out. What else do you have to plug, and where can people find you?
Well, if people are on YouTube watching this, they can go into the search browser and type in The Unknowable.
Okay.
They'll find it's a 40-minute series. Each episode is about 2 minutes. And this is a kind of an indie project that I wrote and directed in 2022, 2023. And if you like that, you can go on to Screenbox that's Scream Box, which is it's basically like Shudder.
Right.
If you've heard of that, it's a horror streaming site.
Yeah.
And a larger version, we sold The Unknowable as a proof of concept, and then did a second season, which is more of a 8 episodes, 22-minute series that I think is really, really well done. I only produced it. My friend Kyle Cooper directed it, and I would say it's very wild. It's Lynchian, kind of literary.
Yeah. No, I watched. I've seen some of the Screenbox version, and it's a very like. I think I told you this at the time. It kind of reminds me of like an Adam Curtis documentary, but mixed with like David Lynch.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. Quick note: after recording this, The Unknowable Darkland became available on Amazon Prime. You can watch the entire series on Prime. The link is in the description.
Yeah, it's very different from Passenger.
Yes, Passenger is like a classic scary movie.
It's a classic scary movie. And I guess if you're in the mood for a bleak, scary movie, you can find my first directorial debut, which is called The Den. Not sure where that is, but it's been
out there somewhere.
It's out there somewhere.
But
if you like dark found footage, maybe check it out.
Well, Zachary, thank you so much for being here.
Oh my God, thank you for having me. This was a blast.
I agree. Sound, it was a challenging sonic episode, but we got through it. And I'm very glad. I'm very glad that we did.
Yes.
And to everyone watching and listening, apologies for the helicopter and the other thing, but thank you for watching and listening. And as always, keep reading.